Hello and welcome to the second episode of my video podcast Cargoflow Talk. My name is Johannes Sommer and I work for more than 25 years in the transport industry and I will be your host. In this format I invite interesting personalities to talk about topics that move our industry. I'm very pleased to have Alessandro Mariani as my today's guest. Hello Alessandro.
Hello, Johannes. Thank you very much for inviting me today. It's a pleasure to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Alessandro, you are heading the logistics of a global beverage company, and in the next roughly 30 minutes, I would like to talk with you about differences in the transport markets between Europe and the US. And I also would like to add that you are speaking today as a private person and express your own opinion and that you don't represent any company here. And before we jump into the topic, Alessandro, could you please tell us a little bit more about you? And how did you find your way into transport and logistics?
Thank you, Johannes, for sure. First of all, I'm Alessandro Mariani. I'm Italian. I'm working in a global environment. And I'm a father of two kids. I'm based here in Austria, and I enjoy what I'm doing, and I enjoy to be in Austria because I'm a passionate skier. I love mountains. I come from a place in the mountains in Italy, and yeah, that is actually something that kept me here for some time by now. How I made it to logistics and transportation. First of all, started my career on the service provider side, and I was working for a major logistics service provider at the beginning of my career, and then I moved to a smaller service logistics provider, and kind of enjoyed it, and I really find the logistics world very interesting. At the beginning of my career, was mostly focused on warehousing actually and contract logistics. And when I moved to the second service provider, was more into called production logistics, and we were just really doing some just-in-time feeding of some production lines. And after that, I moved to a big consumer electronics producer, and I spent 11 years there. And I went there because I got an offer to look into more the international aspect of logistics that I always found very interesting. Personally, I've always been intrigued and very curious about knowing about new worlds. And when I was younger, being Italian, I wanted to move out of my comfort zone and then see what was going on around the world. And that's what I did, thanks to my previous employer, where I really start to learn about logistics, not only in terms of warehousing and contract logistics, but also in terms of transportation, and also in terms of integration of logistics with the other pieces of the supply chain. So thanks to that, I start to work across Europe, and it was a long journey, I would say, that then brought me to the place where I'm today. And I'm here simply because I wanted to learn about more the logistics of the fast-moving consumer goods. That to me was quite interesting. It remains quite interesting, simply because I consider it a bit more demanding in terms of call it challenges, and I wanted to learn a new type of logistics. Let's say every sector has its own peculiarities, and I thought after some years in the consumer electronics was time to move on. And that's where I am today.
And you brought then also your geographical activities. If I understood, you were responsible previously in Italy for the European market, and today you are globally responsible for logistics activities of your current employer, right? And that leads us already to the topic that I would like to talk with you about. You are responsible globally for logistics activities, and I was selling transports for many years in Europe. And if I would get involved in US transport market, Alessandro, what would I have to expect? Is it similar, or do you see differences to the European transport market?
So the markets very, I would say, are very different, are substantially different in my opinion. I see that there are elements of differentiation that are objective there, like the geography of the US, it's completely different from what we are talking about in Europe in terms of extension, in terms of distance, in terms of infrastructure. And that in itself, it's I would say it's a big element of differentiation. When I look into the rail is mostly private in the US, while in Europe it's, let's say, inherited, let's call it like this, by public investments and most of the European companies are not directly controlled, but let's say are very much linked to the local governments. And the approach to rail it's completely different there and plays this a big role also in differentiating the market.
May I ask you, there is of course the big difference privately owned versus a lot of state owned in Europe. What implication does that have? Is rail infrastructure on a similar level in Europe, and is rail used to solve transport challenges in the US more or less than in Europe?
I would say it's definitely used less than in Europe. The fact that there is the rail is mostly private is also creating some, call it, border zones. You know, we have some big operators in the US. They are mostly operating on one or the other coast of the market, and there are some, call it, zones of interferences. But if you look even simply at the infrastructure and the state of those infrastructure, we are talking again a completely different ball game. Just simply, if we look at the electrification, you know, the rail in the US is mostly not electrified, and this in itself it's a topic that needs to be considered even in light of sustainability. It's something that it's for sure bringing some savings in terms of CO2 emission, but not to the level that it can do in Europe because the network is electrified. The market dimension in itself in the US it's a lot bigger. You know, we have a lot more trucks also on the road available compared to Europe. And if you look into the approach to the market, it's also completely different. The market in itself is a lot more dynamic and more aggressive in the US compared to Europe.
What do you mean? What do you mean by that more aggressive, Alessandro? Is it
Let's say, you know, I like to play with loyal partners that are sticking to to their customers, despite the fact that they might have some short-term win if they would just not load at their long-term customers and just jump on the spot rates. This is something that is definitely more difficult to achieve in the US. The tendency to have short-term contracts or spot rates is a lot more present than in Europe. And this is in itself makes the market a lot more dynamic.
Yeah, I understand, and you have to intervene a lot more often, maybe, to find solutions. I can imagine. I mean, when I did agreements with big shippers in Europe, usually those agreements were for 2 or 3 years, and unless there are sometimes you have major events, of course, that are really interrupting supply chains or changing market conditions significantly. But if such events don't occur, usually those contracts are stable over 2 or 3 years. So if I understand you correct, in the US, those long-term contracts are not part of the game, or not as a regular way to cooperate.
Correct.
Do I understand you correct?
Yeah. It's absolutely correct. This is actually I would say a common experience. If you ask for a contract that is longer than a year, they would kind of you can still get it, of course, but it's definitely out of their comfort zone. They are not used to this kind of approach, and it's really a completely different mentality. Is more short term. And this is, I would say, probably is a cultural aspect, or it's also driven by a cultural aspect. It's not only that, but in essence, there is this, call it the reluctancy. And maybe just a concrete example, if you look, for example, fuel surcharge, it's normally uh, within the industry fixed on a weekly basis. For us, of course, even just to manage it, we would like to have it ideally quarterly and maximum
Yeah.
monthly. But to switch these kind of things, you need to ask for it. Let's say they're not coming by default, and by default for them, this is really um, based on a weekly basis. And this is just a detail, but through the details you see a lot more things, and just a self-explanatory detail, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. Um, and when you first were confronted with the US market, when you made your first experiences, what surprised you most in comparison to Europe?
I would say the thing that would stick out if you go in any factory that has a decent output is the parking lot. The parking lot where you would see a huge amount of trailers there
Hmm.
waiting for being loaded. They do have a massive utilization of this, they call it the drop and hook process. It's somehow giving for sure some flexibility at both ends, at the factory and at the carriers when it comes to loading times. At the same time, is of course it's a fundamental element for having a successful supply chain there locally. So the parking lot is something that, as I said, is sticking out, and it's not a parking lot per se, but it's really the extensive utilization of these standby trailers, in essence, that we do have it in Europe, but not to this kind of extent, because of course we are more focused on having those assets moving rather than standing there. So for sure there are reasons as usual behind that. There is an aspect, as I said, of geography. There is an aspect of flexibility that they prefer to have at both ends. But this implies that you might have hundreds really of trucks depending on what is your output. But I would say that rule of the game, at least 3 days of loading in terms of truck equivalent are normally parking in the parking lot in the yard of a factory. And that is for sure something that kind of stick out, and I was not expecting to see apply to that extent.
Mm.
So
And I can underline that this is not so common in Europe, but of course, especially bigger shippers are using this, I call it pick and drop system with empty trailers on the yard. So that I know from Europe as well, but not in a very large scale that I can
correct.
underline. But of course, I can imagine it brings some efficiency and some flexibility when loading the cargo for the shipper.
For sure, for
And
sure.
because what I also learned, trucks are popping up usually most of the trucks on the same time of the day, and then it's super busy. And when you have already preloaded some cargo, it's of course makes the process a little bit smoother.
But never to this extent, as I said, really. If we look into this, uh, as I said, 2 to 3 days of volumes that you would load are normally parked there in terms of truck equivalent. It is massive.
Okay. So if I summarize, in the US, the market players are maybe a little bit more opportunistic on short-term wins, the transport companies, which makes it necessary to intervene more often in finding solutions. So maybe the reliability is then a bit higher in Europe, if I understand that correct.
Absolutely. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely.
What I find actually quite sympathetic is this point with the pick and drop in the US, because also in Europe I was always wondering that this is not done more. Very often it was said there is not enough space for for the trailers. So of course you need a parking lot, as you said, that's a prerequisite to do that. And more is done on road and less is done on rail in the US compared to Europe. And what is of course also a little bit sad when I hear about rail that mostly is done with diesel locomotives. Yeah, we we want to decrease the CO2 emissions, and that's a drawback. Maybe we stick to this topic sustainability a bit, and also the differences here. One thing we touched already, locomotives are running mainly with diesel in the US, but in principle, I mean, we experience that in Europe we are really active in decreasing carbon emissions. And we have also, I would say, quite a lot of regulatory around it, so this European Green Deal, and also with ETS, this European trading system, CO2 gets a price, yeah, and over time that price should increase to boost investments in that. We don't need to talk about that now in detail, but what would really interest me, how is that topic seen in the US? Is the sustainability topic in principle seen as important as here, and or has that changed also in the recent year, because due to the political circumstances we see right now with this complete mind shift? How would you describe this topic in comparison to Europe?
So I think that overall is one of the things again where the two markets are differentiating. In Europe, there is by far a lot more pressure and a lot more focus. If you look into the situation now in the US, because of the current political lead, the focus is completely gone, I would say. All the investments that were actually there and the plans that they had are now declined only at single state level. So we do see some differentiation. As I said, the US is a huge country. California is still pushing for certain changes, and this is also happening in the state of New York. For the rest of the country, it's a lot more difficult. We know that the transition to zero emission will require a lot of investments that can only come from the federal government. And as such, because of the current lead, this is going to be extremely, let's say, on hold, extremely difficult for the foreseeable future. And this is, of course, an element that is also then somehow constraining investors like private companies like the one I work for example, in the initiatives that can be implemented locally. Overall, if we look at the sustainability as a topic, I think the challenges in any case are the same around the world and are mostly driven by the technology. We know that at the moment the zero emission, it's basically possible with BEV trucks, so with electric vehicles. We do know that the price of those vehicles is significantly higher than the cost of a standard truck. We're talking about a factor 3 in this case, without any subsidies. And of course, even here, subsidies means investments from the government to make these things possible. And of course, Europe in itself, it's more call it happy to go into this direction, even though in Europe with the recent changes in the regulation of a few weeks ago, we have seen a certain slowdown in the roadmap. The reduction of the emission is still on the agenda, but the pressure in terms of timing is a little bit decreased compared to only a few months ago, unfortunately. So when I was talking about sustainability and the challenges, as I said, those electric trucks do have two main aspects. First of all, they are depending upon infrastructure for the recharging. There are somehow not always there. And as a second drawback, there is a topic of also payload, as the battery packs in itself are somehow also quite heavy, and in some cases might reduce for heavy goods, might reduce the loading capacity. And so
It's
even
about
here,
it's about 2 tons or less, one and a
yes,
half, 2 tons.
it depends 1 ton, 1 to 1.5 ton, depends also to the trailer that you're using, to the truck that you're using. At the moment, there is the truck with the longest reach. It's heavier than the other one, simply because there's more battery on board. I will not going to name with the producer, but this creates some issues in terms of also axle weight. And so there are some technicalities behind it. And of course, for heavy goods, 1 ton or 1.5 ton could be 1 to 2 pallets less, and so this is not a minor loss, I would say, in the loading capacity. Nevertheless, we see that there is, I would say, an increasing amount of electric trucks on the market in Europe. We are around about 4.5%, I think, of the overall fleet that currently is run on BEV truck in Europe, while in the US, again, if we just compare it, we are not even at a 1% there. So there is definitely more focus and a more buy-in from the market when it comes to this new technology in Europe compared to the US, for the reason that I was trying to
Yeah,
list before.
it's actually a topic which I'm also very interested in, this development in electrification. And all what you said I can underline. It's of course much more expensive, and investments decisions are of course easier done when there are subsidies for the differences in cost. And what I also understood, a decisive topic when it comes to the business case and to an investment decision is also the access to cheap electricity. Yeah, so when you get the kilowatt hour for 20 cent, or in best case even lower, when you have maybe your own photovoltaic on the roof, then the business case can be calculated quite easily with the total costs. Yeah. But of course, it's something new, and I think it's also a little bit of a psychological thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean there is another aspect we didn't mention. It's really related to the reach of those trucks. So at the moment, the market leader in terms of reach is around 500 plus kilometers, and after that you will need a recharge. So there is an aspect of distance that you can cover with a full battery. That is also a question, let's say, compared to a standard combustion engine truck. So in essence, that all these assets and in their usability are not to be evaluated quite in depth. So
The
yeah,
use cases are still a little bit limited due to the range. I agree, but I do know also from experience that there are a lot of use cases where a range of 400 to 500 kilometers per day is enough. I only think about the pre and the on carriage for intermodal transports, for instance, or also domestically. There are a lot of corridors where this is sufficient. But I agree, there is for the long haulage, driving over the whole continent, then this is still not good enough. What we are having, yeah, that's true. And to sum it up, also here you see also differences to the US, that in Europe we are a little bit quicker in this transformation than over the pond.
absolutely. I think we will be ahead in the future simply because we are already investing on the infrastructure, simply because we have a higher utilization of these assets. And like you're saying, there are use cases for those assets, and basically that is where those assets are now tested.
Yeah. But summing up our topic, US versus Europe. So basically there are quite a lot of significant differences how the markets function and how the logistic problems are solved. Leads me to the final question. Do you, in your current role, look after regional playbooks on the different markets, or do you still try to have a standardized approach?
So I think this is a big question that has been on my agenda also in previous roles. uh, I think, in all honesty, in general, for us in logistics, it's always difficult to have a sort of a if I look at now from the industry, from the industry side, they're always the ask to have the one fit all. And I think in the logistics, the one fit all is very difficult, not only because of the market peculiarities we were listing before, but also because of call it the players that are on the market that are not truly global. So this is, I would say, one part of the answer to your question. The second part of the answer to your question is also related to the context that you need to operate. So for us, it's also difficult, and I would say for any industry, you have different level of maturity depending from market to market. And you might have a partner that is actually fitting a more mature scenario, and it's not necessarily fitting other scenarios that are more into the growth phase. And so, as we all like to keep it simple and standardized for these two main arguments, I would say we will still have some, call it ad hoc decisions that need to be done when you are selecting your own partners. And this is somehow what I've seen, and in this case, as I said, is really more the context actually, so more the second part of my answer that should drive your decision, in my opinion. Then of course then need to contextualize to the single reality of the market where you're operating, but it's really your need that needs an answer first.
Yes, okay. So there is then really a good reason to contextualize, as you called it, to contextualize the approach on the market and to adapt the own strategy to the circumstances which you find different in the different markets, right?
Absolutely. I'm a big believer of that. I would think that not doing that would be putting at risk the business ultimately and a reason to fail.
And maybe costly also.
And of course, yeah, and that goes by itself.
We are now coming to the end of our session. What would you say? What would be your advice to supply chain managers and global shippers today? What is needed today to navigate global supply chains successfully?
I think we are heading towards times that are changing the world where we are operating. The world in itself is not as predictable as it was only 2-3 years ago. And in this situation, having call it a margin of flexibility in the pocket, it's definitely what I would recommend. So risk management must be higher on the agenda than in previous years, and it's an item that if it's not on the agenda, must be on the agenda. And this means that having alternative supply location means having the capacity of producing the portfolio in those alternative locations, having different route to markets, making sure that there are cards to put on the table when the unpredictable hit the ground. And this is definitely an aspect that has to be addressed at the strategic level. Next to this flexible approach, I would say the classic parameter of supply chain needs to be in focus. So we definitely need to look into having proper stock level, proper safety stock to respond to the unpredictable, at least for the short term, and at least for the time that you need to put on the ground the alternative solution that you should have in the pocket, or you must have on the pocket. And I would say a third recommendation that in these times of uncertainties and turbulence is really to invest on partnership, on strategic partnership, in the sense that you know the devil, let's say, or you know the friend they have to deal with. And normally having an open and a transparent relation with strategic partners pays off in those times because they know you will be there, you know they will be there for you to help you when it's needed. And this is a third recommendation that I would give to my colleagues to be successful in managing those challenges that for sure will come in the future.
This is a very, very nice final word. In times of increased uncertainty, strategic partnerships and trust gains in importance to march through those uncertain times together. That is something which I fully support and find also very, very important. What remains is to thank you for your time, Alessandro. It was super interesting discussing those topics with you. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you very much, Johannes. It was a great opportunity for me to talk with you today, and it was at least as interesting as it was for you to have this conversation. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.